All right, so do you know the most vulnerable phase of rehabbing an injury? Now, of course, I am talking actually about horse rehabbing an injury. However, this also applies to humans as well. So some might guess that it's right after the injury happens, because thinking like that's the worst it could possibly be, right? And then others might say that when you start your rehab and start the recovery process and you have to go through a ton of pain. However, there are a select few that would point out that when you're about 90% of the way done with your rehab, that's when you're the most vulnerable. Now, I'm gonna say those few are the ones that happen to be right. If you don't believe me though, let's talk about it. So ask any athlete what the worst thing that could possibly happen is, and the universal answer is always going to be injuries. And especially as equestrian athletes, the number one priority is horse soundness. Honestly, as an equestrian too, when our horses are injured, I mean, especially in those agonizing days where you don't really know what's wrong. I mean, when our horses are hurt, we're hurt. And I just wanted to make this video to kind of help everybody feel at ease that we're all in that same boat of, oh my God, I hope I do it right, because there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of things that you can't just talk to your horse about. So it makes it a little different than a human injury rehab. But for athletics, since injuries are literally inevitable for both horse and rider, the goal isn't to avoid them, but to ensure that we do the most effective rehab we possibly can. So there are 4 components to a successful rehab, and they are: 1, you get the correct diagnosis. It sounds simple, but without an accurate diagnosis, you're literally going to be rehabbing the wrong thing. Correct diagnosis is number 1, especially with horses who can't talk to you. Sometimes I have been on the receiving end of a wrong diagnosis, and not saying that the vets are wrong, it's just that the horse doesn't point you in the right direction. The second one is your rest phase. Now, this is the time for the injury to heal without any additional pressure or activity. So this phase could last a day, a week, a couple of months. It just depends on the severity of the injury, but it's all about patience. Don't be in a rush to get to phase 3, which is your mobility phase. And once your injury can handle it, then you begin to start restoring movement. And this is often the most painful phase. And honestly, your injury is not actually healed at this point. So you have to work through a bit of pain at this point. So after you get through the pain, then you're gonna go into phase 4, which is your strength phase. So after mobility is regained and you've gone through the tough challenge of getting mobility back in that injured body part, then the next step is to strengthen not only that body part, but the body parts around it, your muscles around it, because you want to not only prevent future re-injury of that same exact space, but also you don't want your injury to become chronic, because you'll pay for that later. These are the 4 steps of a successful rehab, and depending on the severity of your injury, these steps can take anywhere from a day, a week, over a year, but the recovery process follows this very similar pattern. It depends on the type of injury, and it depends on what you're doing to rehab the injury. And unfortunately, when it comes to any one of these phases, and if you know anything about rehabbing an injury, when you're in any one of these phases, there is always a chance, like when you're playing Monopoly, that you'll just get sent to jail and you don't get to collect that $200. So you always have to be really careful. Speaking of careful, we want to avoid these 3 what I call injury bombs. These are three things to avoid at all costs. So number 1 is rushing. It's hard to be patient during recovery, but by rushing, you are risking re-injury or even permanent loss of function, and especially when you're dealing with a horse that can't talk to you about how rehab is going. So the second one is skipping the strengthening. If you actually don't prioritize re-strengthening not only the injured body part, but your entire body, because guess what? When you're in that rest and rehab phase, your body loses all of its muscles. It doesn't just pick and choose which ones. So you need to not only focus on the strengthening of that body part in particular, but also your entire body as a whole. And this does go for your horse as well. Your horse needs strength in all areas to help compensate for any injury rehab that your horse is facing. The third one is why I made this video in the first place. The most vulnerable time an injury is in is when it's about 90% of the way healed, because what happens is you actually forget that you're injured, and we've all had this moment when you're rehabbing an injury where you go take a step too fast, or you go up the stairs the way you're used to, or you go and you you move or you ask the way that you were used to doing in the past. However, since your injury, there is now a different way that your body part moves. And for whether it's just a second that you get reminded of your injury, or you fully take a few steps back to square one, which is something that's happened to me with when I tore my Achilles. You have to be very careful when you're at about 90% of the way healed that you don't forget how hard you worked to get to that 90%. And the same thing goes for horses. When your horse starts feeling better, when the vet says, we look at the ultrasound and they say, yeah, you look good. That's not the time to go like balls to the wall, pedal to the metal. Oh my God, we go right back to full work. No, that's when the horse is the most vulnerable. And that's when you have to execute on that patience more than any other point of the rehab. And it's so funny because it's so easy at the end of a rehab to just push it a little bit because you're almost done. You can see the finish flags. And so unfortunately though, that pain when you are rehabbing your own injury is your own reminder, but your horse can't necessarily tell you when they get that reminder. And so you just have to be really conscientious of that fact that applies to both us as riders and them as horses, all athletes. However, I do want to point out, because I don't want to be too negative, is that if you do rehab correct, you can not only make an impact on your rehab, but you can actually come back better than before, because if you take that time to really focus on whatever weaknesses you had that caused the injury in the first place, you could potentially come back from an injury stronger than you did before you were injured in the first place. Okay, so we've gone over the components of a successful rehab, things to definitely avoid when rehabbing, but here are my 3 tips for specifically having injury rehab success with horses. So tip number 1 is avoid drugs if at all possible. Honestly, when it comes to giving your horse drugs when they're rehabbing, I totally understand. I've had horses like this where they lose their freaking minds and you have to give them drugs because they're at risk of re-injuring themselves by simply being, a little pent up and just a little kooky. So if your horse is in that situation, don't feel guilty about the fact that you can't avoid this tip. But if you have the option and you're in a bit of a gray zone, I would highly suggest not using drugs if you have the chance to do so, partly for 2 reasons. One is when you're riding the horse and they're drugged, then that's going to give you a different feel of how they actually are when they're not drugged. And you can't really assess how they're moving and how their body is actually handling the rehab if there's a mask on it. Drugs are just a mask. It's a way to avoid pain. And obviously you're trying to avoid mental psychoticness, but it's still avoiding. And so as a rider, you can't actually feel what's going on because the pain is being masked. The second side to that is that if the pain is being masked and something happens while you're in the middle of a rehab, say you're doing one of your trot sets or you just added in canter sets and your horse, is a little masked because they're on drugs, then you cannot feel, and more importantly, they cannot feel if they accidentally re-injure themselves in the rehab process. So it's really, if you can, avoid drugs during the mobility and strength phases if possible, just to ensure that you're not actually masking any signs of injury re-aggravation or re-injury altogether. So tip number 2 is that rehab is actually just relearning. The thing when you injure a body part is that your body has to relearn how to use that body part. When I was a gymnast, honestly, I injured every single body part I have. I know for a fact that when you injure all your body parts start at 10, let's say, and when you injure a body part and you do a rehab, the best you could possibly get back to is, let's say, like a 9.5. You're never going to be able to get back to how you were, but you can get back pretty darn close. And then what you can also do is you can strengthen the other areas around wherever you were injured to help that 9.5 not become worse and worse and worse over time, because injuries take quite a lot of care, effort, and conscious ability to push yourself, but not push yourself too hard so that you hurt yourself. Rehabbing is relearning. So whether you are rehabbing or whether your horse is rehabbing, you really have to give your horse or yourself the space to be able to feel what it feels like to use that body part now, because guaranteed it's different and it works differently. So for instance, my Achilles, when I tore my Achilles, before I tore my Achilles, I was able to walk around every which way, every other way. Like, I was able to do whatever I wanted to do in terms of walking. However, now, even though my Achilles has been healed for multiple years, since
1 hour later.
So my Achilles has been healed since 2022. However, it loves to remind me every time I am walking out in the field with the horse and there's a hole, like a squirrel hole or something that I miss and accidentally step on and that Achilles gets tugged. My Achilles never misses an opportunity to remind me that it does not appreciate when it's stretched quickly like that. And so that's one of the things that when you are rehabbing an injury, you have to be very conscious of when your injury gets reactivated. And the problem with horses is they can't tell you when those moments happen, and I best believe that they do. That's why tip number 1 and tip number 2 are a little bit conjoined, because if you don't drug them, then you have the best chance of feeling when these things happen. Every horse is going to tell you about a different amount of pain. There's the ones that sit over here and complain about every second of every day. And then there's the very stoic ones like my horse that would never tell you. So you have to know your horse, and you have to also understand that recovery is not always linear, and only through those step backs are you going to actually be able to push through the full recovery process. So tip number 3 is that there is no antidote for injuries, but there is such a thing as prevention. And that is the 4th step, the 4th component of a successful rehab. The reality is that if you're able to build strength within your body and you're able to better utilize, have better movement for horses, it's specific that if they're able to use their hind end better, if they're able to use their abs better, then that relieves pressure on all the other body parts. And so my tip number 3 for successful rehab is just the fact that I had a lot of success using the Equiband with Fuego's rehab, and it was to the point where when he was injured, the vet basically said he was never going to be an upper level competition horse. Fast forward 3 years, and now he's getting ready to go advanced. If rehab is done correctly, then there is no limit to actually what your horse can come back from. However, you have to make sure that your rehab was completely diligent. And I don't actually care if you use the Equiband. I've posted a lot of videos on YouTube about how to use the Equiband, how to build a program for the Equiband. I created an entire spreadsheet called the Equitracker so that you can figure out not only how tight the bands need to be, but how long to use them for. I can link that video. It's definitely in the description. But the point is that whether you choose to use the Equiband or not, this is about rehabbing your horse. And whether or not you choose to use the Equiband is kind of besides the point. The point is that you absolutely cannot skip the strength building section of your rehab. That is the most key and crucial point. I mean, aside from avoiding that 90% whoopsie doodle, and hopefully you don't re-injure yourself, but it is a swift, stark reminder of what injury you had and where it hurts. Because, man, if I had a nickel for every time I did that, wouldn't even have to work anymore. Like I said, though, whether or not you use the Equiband is kind of besides the point. There's tons and tons and tons of videos that I've made to help you if you do want to use the Equiband. But at the end of the day, whether or not you use the Equiband is besides the point, because the strength, what that tool does, some people like Pessoas, some people like, everybody has their preference. Not arguing about preference. However, if you don't include any strength in your rehab process, then your rehab will be missing a key component and will not withstand the test of time, because that is what rehab is for. You're going to spend 1 year being very focused on getting your horse back to square zero, and how well you do on the rehab is going to be reflected in how long it takes you to have to rehab again. A couple final thoughts. We went over the 4 main components of a successful rehab. We went over the 3 things to massively avoid when it comes to your rehab process, and identifying the most vulnerable point of any rehab, which, like I said, I don't think everybody agrees with me necessarily off the top of their head. However, after listening to this video, I am curious down in the comments below if you do agree with me that the most vulnerable point of any rehab is right before you think you're done. because you're like, your patience has run out, you just want to be recovered already. And same with the horse. When the vet says you get the green light, everyone's like gung-ho, but that's when you pump the brakes, because you go, okay, we're in a good spot. Let's just idly glide into our gung-ho. And then, of course, we went over 3 tips for a successful rehab. Don't use drugs if you really don't have to. The second thing is, rehab is relearning how to use the body part, relearning how the body part is by comparison to other body parts, because one of the other big risks when you're rehabbing an injury is the chance of injuring something else because you're compensating when you're rehabbing. So you have to relearn how to use your body part so that not only it's being used to its best advantage, but also that you're not accidentally hurting other body parts in the process of relearning how to use that body part. And number 3, I recommend using the Equiband. I have tons and tons of videos on YouTube if you have any questions whatsoever about how to use the Equiband. But at the end of the day, the point of using the Equiband is to get strength, not only in your horse's hind end, but engaging their core strength as well. This creates better usage of your horse's body, which therefore makes it alleviates pressure. So for instance, my horse had a leg injury, but because he doesn't actually use his abs to the fullest of his ability, it was creating a lot of front end pressure, and he ended up just getting hurt because of how he was using his body. So I enjoyed using the Equiband because it taught my horse how to use his body correctly without my nagging. I get it. You can be a great rider and get the horse to engage their abs. However, I will say that if you want to focus on the other 100 things that you have to focus on while being a rider, then I would say add in the Equiband, because the Equiband's going to make them engage their core, and then you can focus on greener pastures. Just know, if you are an equestrian going through a horse rehab, you are not alone, and rehab is challenging in every sport, but equestrians shy away from talking about it. So just know, if you found this video and you found this video helpful, I have a ton of videos on this channel that'll help you with just this. So if you're ready for more guidance on how to have a successful horse rehab, then definitely click some of the links in the description below. Also, like, subscribe, comment, because I post videos about horse care, horse rehab, the Equiband, and all things equestrian on this channel. So looking forward to talking with you down in the comments, because I'm curious what you think is the most vulnerable point of any rehab, whether it's a human rehab or a horse rehab. But until then, happy rehabbing.